one thing that I've mentioned before, and I'll mention it again here, outlaying something like this as a challenge to talk about in places like the United States, where there isn't much intense forms of persecution, which I think, because we have our own idea of what persecution is and what it looks like, and it's not really that bad. We don't like it, but it's still not that bad. And we think of anything that is that bad that will cause people to want to come out against us and to harm us and even kill us is not going to happen to us, because we're going to be raptured out of here before then. But it's going to happen to people who come to Christ during the tribulation. And as I've told you, I don't believe that is what Scripture is pointing to, or what Scripture actually says. And this challenge, it's you kind of think, and you kind of wonder, because people can look at something like this. They can look at even what happens at the two witnesses, and they think there's no way that something like that can really happen to the church in the here and now. I mean, if you're saying that this represents things that happen between the first and second comings of Christ, I think you're a little bit off from that, because I don't see that happening now. It's not happening to us now, at least not to that upscale of a degree. And I would say, yeah, you're right, it's not happening to that much of a degree, but I think that there's reasons why that's not the case. Number one, I guess you could say there's a certain element of it by the grace and protection of God, for one thing. But I think that God would be one who would allow certain things of that in a more intense form to happen as time goes on. We talked about how God even has authority over that. We talked about that last time too. But here's the thing. We aren't unfamiliar with persecution of some sort, even outside of the Christian world. Are we? We're not. We're not. One thing I think that I've mentioned before, and I've described and I've discussed before, is that it is amazing to me how in the world of politics, for example, you have conservatives versus liberals, Republicans versus Democrats, and more so on the liberal side, you have people who will cancel other people on the other side, or will be vicious or malicious to people who are conservatives or identify themselves as Republicans, because of the beliefs that they hold, or because they, for example, believe that a man can't be a woman and a woman can't become a man, and vice, all those sorts of things. If you say the wrong thing, people will do whatever they can to cancel you. I mean, that's just the reality of the world that we live in now. But the thing is that that's not necessarily a spiritual Christian sort of persecution, because that sort of thing is happening in abundance to unbelievers. The level of that sort of thing that we see of unbelievers against other unbelievers, cancel culture. You can't say this. If you say this, we're gonna get you, and that sort of thing. We can see that in a certain sense as sort of a political persecution. Now, here's the thing. Many people in the Christian church today have morphed themselves into that realm, into that area, and any sort of backlash they have on that's sort of quote unquote persecution that they get. But really, how can we call it true, authentic persecution because of your faith when, really we're not making ourselves distinctive by preaching the gospel? Because truth be told, if we're just talking about persecution against conservatism, you have an abundance of unbelievers who are being persecuted because of their conservative beliefs. And the thing that has happened here is that you have a lot of Christians who, have somehow, I think, kind of morphed the two. But you can't morph the two. The gospel isn't conservatism, the conservatism isn't the gospel. And for those people who consciously or unconsciously are combining the two, you have to stop that. You can't do that anymore. So we think about this whole thing of, we don't see the intense form of persecution against our faith because, we just don't see that sort of thing here. Well, yeah, because the question is, is the gospel really being preached as it should be in the first place in our country today? The gospel, let me tell you this, and I'm sure I've mentioned this before, the gospel is much more offensive than anything having to do with conservative ideology. I can tell you that with much confidence. If we're looking for more intense forms of persecution, it's probably going to come if people preach the unadulterated gospel. But you see, that's not what's happening. And many Christians have become more preoccupied with arguing about politics and suffering the same sort of quote-unquote persecution that other non-believers are suffering. Now listen, you start preaching the unadulterated gospel, and even the people that Christians are suffering alongside with, who are unbelievers, they might start distancing themselves from from true believers when you start spouting out the gospel and all of its truth. But we started to put our focus on the wrong thing. So we look at things like we see in Revelation chapter 11, and even with what we're going to see, later on down the road in the book of Revelation, and we say we can't relate. And yes, I would say I agree. That's true. Could it possibly be because we really are focusing on the wrong thing, and that we're not focused on the gospel to begin with? If we started preaching the gospel all around us in its true, unadulterated form and put our focus on that, it's not going to take long. It's not going to take long for that uptick, at the very least, of attitude from people of the world towards us to really be made apparent. I can tell you that right now. But we have to put our focus on what truly matters and what truly is most important.